radios and indoor antennas. An intriguing combination. This is a true story about a true story. Hello and thanks for joining us on this channel. My name is Peter Waters, my call sign is G30JV. I've had quite a few inquiries over the last months about indoor antennas because I do appreciate that some of you haven't got gardens and that you're looking for alternatives, and I can sympathise with you. Well, it reminded me of something that happened a long time ago now, but let me tell you the connection between spies and indoor antennas. Quite a few years ago now, I was a member of an amateur dramatic group, and we were put on a play called Pack of Lies. Now this play was the true story of the Krogers, Peter and Helen Kroger, who were spies and convicted back in 1961. It wasn't their real names actually, but they were known as Helen and Peter Kroger. They lived in Ruislip in a bungalow, quite a normal bungalow in a rural location, and they were very friendly with people across the road, the near neighbours. And it was quite a normal relationship as far as the neighbours were concerned, but what was going on in that bungalow was something totally different. You see, the Krogers were spies. They had been living in America. They fled America, came into the UK and were working for the Russians. And their job was actually to pass secrets, naval secrets, from Portland back to Moscow. Peter Kroger portrayed himself as a bookseller, selling rare books, and his wife was simply a domestic wife, except that she was a trained radio operator and cipher clerk. So between the two of them, they were spying for the Russians. And what they were doing is they were taking the information from an intermediary and they were sending it in sort of micro dots in books. And they had a radio system. Now the radio system they had was simply to tell the Russians that a book was on its way, and in that particular book were microdots which contained details, naval secrets and so forth. So that was their task. I've got some photographs here of the transmitter or transceiver that I think they were using, and to give you some idea, it's not particularly large. And if you look at it, you'll see a sort of a wire aerial there, and you're starting to see the connection between spies and indoor antennas. Anyway, just to go back a bit, in this play, The Pack of Lies, it was all about the neighbours and how difficult it was for the neighbours, because MI5 were onto them and they had to work fairly quickly, but they needed to know who was coming and who was going to this house. And so they told the neighbours, they didn't ask, they said to the neighbours, we need to take over your front bedroom. We need to have somebody there. And they said, well, you know, how often, how long? They said, oh, it's going to be permanent. We're going to have an officer in that front bedroom with cameras and notebook. And I'm sorry, but you haven't got a choice. Well, it was quite a blow to them because these neighbours were friendly with the Krogers and they were told they had to maintain that friendship as if nothing had happened. Well, long story short, ultimately, after they were arrested, the wife in this house, the neighbour, she suffered terribly with mental issues because of the strain she felt under. She was actually portraying herself as the normal, friendly neighbour with the Krogers, knowing full well that upstairs in her house was an officer who was spying on the Krogers. Sad, but there we are, and eventually she died. The the reason the play actually came to be written was because the neighbour's daughter became a BBC presenter, and she was talking one day to the guy that wrote this play, eventually wrote this play, telling her story, and so it was written into a play. So there we are. That's the connection between me. I'm going to say me and the Krogers. Me and knowing the Krogers, not no connection. Anyway, it prompted me to look at indoor antennas because I was curious about the fact that they had to use indoor antennas and how well it would work. And that's really the connection. So this is leading on to me now talking about indoor antennas. But just before we get on to indoor antennas, my wife heard that I was talking about spies and spy radios and so forth, and she said to me, "You've got a couple of spy radios, haven't you?" And I said, "Have I?" She said yes. She told me where they were. Well, I suppose they are spy radios in a sense, so let me just show you what I've got in a cupboard. I hasten to add that I'm not a spy, you'll have to believe me. Anyway, let's have a look at the cupboard and see what I've got. The radio in this picture is made by Telefunken, and it was given to me quite a few years ago now. I can't even remember how it happened, but it is a radio that covers the shortwave spectrum, and it uses a series of plug-in coils, rather like the old HRO, but very much upmarket. And I think it must have an internal rechargeable battery. In fact, I haven't actually opened the unit to find out what's inside it. Some of you watching this may know more than I do. But anyway, it's a radio that covers the complete shortwave spectrum, and I think was part of some sort of spy kit. This is the famous B2 transmitter and receiver. They actually were built into a suitcase with power supply, and it's quite rare to see the complete system now. I actually had one of these working many years ago, back in the mid-60s I think, when I used it on 7 megahertz. This particular one has a crystal for 5.5 megahertz plugged in, so it gives you some idea of the frequency that they operated on. I'll go in a bit closer now so you can get a better idea or look at the detail of the radio. Should explain that the bottom one is the transmitter, and the upper one obviously the receiver. So separate units, so obviously you had to net the receiver, or rather the transmitter onto the receiver, or vice versa. And as you see, it uses plug-in coils, which was not uncommon in those days. This would have been used during the Second World War. And how things have changed now with this Texan PL990, all modes, all bands, and ultra stable. When considering indoor antennas, I think the type of house you're in obviously is going to determine how easy it is to install an indoor antenna, and perhaps more to the point, how effective it's going to be. I think generally speaking, older houses present lesser a problem in some ways. Modern houses have additional insulation. Anything that is metallic, of course, is going to be a bit of a problem. And although I've no first-hand experience, I believe that solar panels can cause quite a bit of noise. So if you're in an older house that hasn't got solar panels, then probably you're in a somewhat better position. But I can't really say too much more on that because I'm not an expert on house construction, but you will probably be aware of the limitations that you may have in your particular house. The Krogers didn't have that problem. Looking at the photos of their bungalow, it looks as if it was a sort of 1930s, 1940s, probably not even cavity walls. So there we are. So there are two places that you can put an indoor antenna, either in one of the rooms or in the attic. Now let's cover rooms first of all. I've used indoor antennas quite a lot over my years, and I've come to the conclusion that if you're going to install an antenna in a room, then by far and away the best option is a loop antenna. Loop antenna is quite compact. It has the ability to reject a significant amount of noise, so it gives you a somewhat quieter receiving situation, and it is also easily tunable. And of course there is the domestic situation that wires hanging around in a room tend not to be the most satisfactory way of installing an antenna. So a loop antenna, I found, is by far and away the best option. It's also quite efficient, and that is a significant advantage, the efficiency of the antenna. You can position it away from walls and away from any metalwork wiring and so forth. It's not too difficult to build your own. You do need a variable capacitor to build your own. I've covered very recently in a video the AL705, which Icon market, and we also sell ourselves the Alex loop, which is a very popular loop. I've used it on numerous occasions, both indoors and outdoors, and it does work quite well. The situation with the loop in terms of power, you generally speaking can't run more than 20 watts to a loop antenna, certainly one that's designed for indoor use and portable. And that's no bad thing, because you don't want to run too much power from a loop because you're going to be in close proximity to it. I suppose that's something which we really need to consider. If you're operating indoors with an indoor antenna, then you are much closer to that antenna than you would otherwise be. As frequencies go up, so the health danger gets more significance. If you're operating on 80, 40, 20 meters and you're, I don't know, several feet away from the antenna, and you're running 20 watts, there's not really a problem as I understand it. Even at 10 meters, on the 10 meter band, there's not too much of a problem, again, because you're only running 10 or 20 watts into the loop. I wouldn't suggest you run higher than that indoors from a loop. If you prefer to put a wire antenna up of some sort, then, and you can be about 10 foot away from it, fine. But as I say, my own experience is that a loop wins hands down, because it's so manageable and it's so ideal for indoor use. Now, on the point of health, somebody did say to me fairly recently actually that it wasn't very sensible to run they were talking about the AL705 actually, which has a power limitation of 10 watts. And they were saying that it's not very sensible to run a loop like that when you're so near it. Well, in terms of proximity, I think I was about 3 or 4 foot away from it. In actual fact, I was running only 5 watts from the IC705, and I was running SSB or CW. Now, both those modes are intermittent modes. In other words, CW is on off, and sideband is peak and trough and so forth. So if you're running 5 watts of sideband or 5 watts of CW, the average power is more like 2.5 watts. Compare that to a 2 meter handheld running 5 watts, where the antenna may be inches away from your face. I think I'd rather run 5 watts of SSB or CW on 14 megahertz than 5 watts of continuous power on 144 megahertz. Think about it. So with a loop antenna, it's very easy to set up, it's very easy to pack away, and you can tune it bang on the nose, and with a loop you should get at least 1.5 to 1 VSWI quite easily. It's very selective, so it doesn't mean to say that if you move around the band you're going to have to retune it, but retuning is quite easy. It's very obvious from listening to the peak on the receiver. It's very obvious when it's almost on the nose, and it's a solution which I would thoroughly recommend. So let's move on now to the attic, which does offer somewhat more opportunities. An antenna in the attic is not a bad antenna to consider, particularly in the older house. I mean, as I said earlier on, if you've got insulation material in there that's got metal in it, that's going to be a bit of a problem. If you've got solar panels, then I believe that is going to be quite a significant problem as well, but you will have to check that out for yourself. Anyway, let's take the normal, normal house. Let's take the house which has got an attic, which hasn't got solar panels. There's usually a fair amount of room in the attic, and so my recommendation would be to consider a wire antenna. Now, I know there's a number of you that may have tried dipoles and had good success with them, and there's nothing wrong with a dipole in the roof area. The only problem is, of course, as I've said in an earlier video, that a dipole is fundamentally a single band antenna, and therefore if you want to operate on more than one band, you're going to have to somehow multi-band it, which means putting traps in. My experience of putting dipoles in the loft or the attic is that you spend an awful lot of time going up and down the steps into the loft to try and get it adjusted correctly. You could, of course, consider an end-fed half wave. The only problem with that is, again, that it's got to be resonant. It's got to be resonant on the fundamental band, and it depends on how much space you've got in the roof. For example, if you want to operate on 40, 20, 15 and 10, you're going to have a wire up there which is 66 foot long, which may be pushing it a bit for some lofts, even though you can bend it around and so forth. If you go shorter, the next length will be 33 feet or thereabouts, which gives you 20, but only gives you 20 and 10. It doesn't give you 15. So that in itself is a bit limiting. I have found, again through experience, that the best antenna for a loft is actually a doublet. Now, I've covered doublets as well in previous videos. Doublet basically is a dipole fed with open wire or balanced feeder. Now, by far and away the most popular form of feeder is 450 ohm ladder line, because it's lightweight, it's rigid, it's easy to manage, and it does the job. The advantage of a doublet is that it is multi-band, and that really is the clincher for me, that it's just a simple multi-band antenna that you can put in the loft. You can also bend it around a bit, and it doesn't seem to mind too much. And of course you have got total control over matching. Now, it's important to understand that a doublet is a fixed length. It's not, you don't adjust the frequency of a doublet, you just adjust the matching. Some people think a doublet is an antenna which you can tune. Well, no, it's an antenna which you can match. The big advantage of a doublet is you can match it on a wide range of frequencies, and the loss on the feeder is very small. In an indoor situation, of course, the feeder is going to be small anyway, but the fact remains that if you tried using coax cable, you'd have the highest WR unless you were actually on the resonant point of the dipole. With a doublet, that's not a problem. You've got no loss on the balanced line, and it's easy to match, provided you've got some form of antenna matching unit. Getting the 450 ohm ladder line through the ceiling is quite easy. What you do is you bare the ends of the 450 ohm ladder line, and you simply drill two small holes in the ceiling, which can easily be refilled and made invisible using your drill. And then you join the ladder line from the ceiling back down to your matcher using this electrical connecting block. Here is a drawing of one side of the doublet to the left hand side, and the important thing really is the total length. It's not only the length of the radiating element, the horizontal section, but also the feeder as well, the 450 ohm ladder line. You want to try and avoid that being exactly a half wave long or multiples thereof, because if it's a half wave long, you're going to get quite a high voltage point at the feed point, and that is something you really want to try and avoid. Don't get too bogged down on this length, it's just something that you should be aware of. One of the things that you'll find is that if you do have problems in matching and it becomes really difficult, usually changing the length of the feeder or the element will solve the problem. Now, let's assume that you've got quite a decent length of element up in the loft and you're really happy with that, but you've got a matching problem and you suspect that the total length is wrong. There is a trick that I've used in the past which enables you to effectively change the length of the feeder without doing it. And what I've done in the past is to make a couple of small inductors. Just a few turns around a bit of piping will do the trick. I'll put a diagram up on the screen here, and you can see that I've inserted a couple of small inductors. Now, don't ask me what the diameter is and what the winding should be. It's a try it and see, suck it and see situation. If you get yourself some piping, bit of plastic piping, about 3/4 of an inch diameter, something like that, and wind about 10 or 12 turns of wire around it, and insert that. That will effectively change the length of the feeder and may well get you out of trouble. Now, a few do's and don'ts about the antenna element itself in the attic. Try and keep it well above the joists on the floor level you're standing on, because those joists will be carrying electrical cable. You don't really want your aerial near electrical cable. You may pick up noise and you may cause interference to devices around the house. So try and keep the antenna elements well up near the roof. The good thing about most houses is very easy to put little tacks in or nails in and fasten the elements against the joists and rafters and so forth. You haven't got too much of a problem in actually supporting the elements. Just keep them well above the sort of rafter level, away from the electrical cables. And don't be frightened of bending it. You should be able to get a reasonable length. You can go out in the longest direction of the loft, then go across and then back, almost like a loop, but don't complete the loop, almost like a loop. And that will give you a reasonable length of wire. And then your 450 ohm ladder line goes down into the shack. Bear in mind, of course, with this installation, you can run 100 watts okay, and you shouldn't have any problem, not from a health point of view anyway. You should have no problem. So you can radiate a fairly decent signal. And if you stand out in the garden and look at the roof of your house, you'll think, well, wait a minute, if I had an area outside this height, it wouldn't be too bad. So that is why very often you can get some fairly good results from antennas in the loft. The big problem really is how long the antenna is and feeding it. And I think we've solved the feeding problem. Now, as regards feeding it in the radio room, in the shack, you could get away sometimes with a simple balun, taking that straight into the output of the transceiver. If your transceiver's got an antenna tuner in it, then get yourself either a 4-to-1 or a 1-to-1 balun. It doesn't seem to make too much difference actually. Get yourself a 4-to-1 or a 1-to-1 balun. Take the 450 ohm ladder line onto the terminals of the balun and the coax output straight into your transceiver, and just see if the internal tuner of your transceiver will match. And try it on several bands, because I suspect that you will find that you will get a match on some bands. On others it may struggle, and that's when you may have to think, well, wait a minute, do I need to put a bit of inductance in to effectively increase the length of the feeder, or do I need to go up in the loft and try reducing the length of the element? And you can do that simply by folding it back on itself. Don't cut it. Just fold the element tightly back on itself, so the wire bent right back on itself for about a metre or so, and see if that improves things. You may well find that you can't get something, an arrangement that works on all bands, and I would be surprised if you do. You probably will need an external antenna tuner or antenna matcher, because external antenna matchers have got quite a wide range. They've also, generally speaking, got a balanced output as well, so you can take your 450 ohm ladder line straight onto the balanced terminals, and then that matcher goes into your transceiver. And if you have that arrangement, turn your internal ATU off, otherwise you'd be chasing your tail. Make sure that you turn the internal ATU off in your transceiver if you use an external matcher. And that probably is the most reliable way of getting a decent match, and then you should be able to operate on all bands. Now, one other thing that I'll mention is that the overall length of the radiating element can be less than a half wave. In other words, if you've got a length of antenna which gives you, say, a half wave on 40 metres, say for example you've managed to get 20 metres of wire up into your loft by bending it around, and therefore that effectively looks like a 40 metre dipole. You probably can operate on the next band down, which is 5 megahertz, and I have found that myself, that you can operate on 5 megahertz with a top section of 20 metres. You might even squeeze 80 metres, and don't be surprised, because it can happen. Basically what's happening is that the part of the antenna is actually formed in that 450 ohm ladder line. So the whole aerial is folded down on itself, and although you still won't have a full length of for 80 metres, you may well find that you can load it, and if you can load it, it will radiate. If it radiates, you'll work somebody. It won't be as efficient as an 80 metre dipole outside, but you might be surprised, so give it a try. There we are. Spy radio and indoor antennas. There is a connection, although I think that the ham radio fraternity can produce a much more efficient indoor antenna than the Krogers ever could. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And by the way, if you're thinking about an indoor antenna but you don't want to spend too much time or money on it, try a single band dipole. A dipole for 15 metres is what, 22, 23 foot long, so that would fit into a lot of attics. And 15 metres is starting to open now. 10 metres, that's also opening occasionally. That's even smaller, so a bit of coax cable and a simple dipole in the attic might be of interest. And of course, we're in the middle of the winter now, so you haven't got to worry about the weather. It doesn't even have to be weatherproof. There we are. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to press subscribe button. In the meantime, take care, enjoy your ham radio, keep safe. Bye.